This is Luke from Angelspit, entering your cinematic universe in 3, 2, 1. Take it away, Autumn!
Thanks, Angelspit. Welcome to your cinematic universe. What is your cinematic universe? Well, you're already creating it right now, whether it's a post on social media, fan art, fan fiction. All that's left to do is mold it all together into one big cinematic universe, your cinematic universe. Here at New York Comic Con, we're going to figure out how to elevate storytelling with the audience. I've got 5 incredible panelists here to help us figure this out. We have Ahmed Best, host of Star Wars Jedi Temple Challenge, and he also plays 3 characters in the Star Wars universe. We have Jeff Gomez, the leading mind in transmedia storytelling and advisor to Disney for Star Wars and Marvel. Danny Fingeroth, the author of Stan Lee's biography, best known for his long stint as editor of Spider-Man comic. Aaron Vanek, founder of LARP Census and a game design educator. And finally, Jan Lucanus, the founder of reelwUrld, which is a startup building cinematic universes with fandom, and he's also the creator of Justice for Hire.
And let's, of course, remember Autumn Noel Kelly, our moderator, former Newsweek journalist, and audience development editor at IO9 and Gizmodo.
There's a separation between fans and brands, storytellers, and those who consume the stories, especially within the studio structure. When, how, and why did the current culture get set in the way of thinking that audience and story are 2 separate entities? I'd love to hear from you, Jeff, because of your transmedia storytelling background.
Well, I've been talking about this for a long time, Autumn, and what is fascinating to me is that that narrative story began in the prehistory of humanity as a collective experience. A story was shared by indigenous people around the campfire or in the cave, and so that was a kind of conversation. The one in the tribe, so to speak, who was more imaginative, perhaps more sensitive to the world, might have started sharing a little bit more. But if that person didn't adjust the narrative to be inclusive, to acknowledge the participation of others, that person did not remain the storyteller for long. And so there was a kind of communal narrative in early humanity. That started to change once we became capable of projecting story beyond our immediate community. And it became supercharged in the Industrial Revolution when we were capable of generating newspapers and novels and dividing ourselves from those who were telling the story to those many more who were receiving the story. Then the story became the purview of, well, the elite, those who could afford to communicate to the masses, helped to shape the reality that the masses perceived. And that only became stronger and stronger. What fascinates me about what we're talking about here, the audience participation, the fan culture, I remember when cards and letters were sent to CBS about Star Trek, because the fans wanted a 3rd season of Star Trek after it was canceled. That was one of the first times where audience participation, where the audience voice actually influenced a major television network to alter its plan and extend, I'm simplifying, of course, Danny, where they caused a change that we feel, you know, all these years later, because Star Trek, of course, went on to become a major story world. My personal experience of where things really started to change was that I was in charge of the editorial letters at a comic book company called Valiant. And I started to notice that the fans didn't particularly like the editorial direction of the comics at the time. And that kind of preceded problems with sales. And then I started to see a fan discussion about comic books on these bulletin boards on the internet, and started to notice how, because of anonymity, it became darker, more extreme, and problematic. And this was in the early 1990s. So you then started to see the toxicity that started to creep into this participative culture.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that. I think there's a very small window in which audience participation and what I do as a performing artist and as a narrative storyteller has been separated. You know, for, I think, like for much what Jeff said, for most of human history, the audience and the narrative have been one and the same. And, you know, I mean, going back to even the old Globe at the Shakespeare Theater, you know, the raked stage and the audience being able to like touch like the fake blood that comes down and giving back that energy to the actors on stage. And even when you're talking about early film history with the silent movies, there was a piano player in the house, and that piano player would interact with the audience as well. And then, you know, when sound started entering the cinema, the separation began. But in certain, you know, cultural environments, it never ended. Like, I don't know if you've ever been to a movie theater in a Black neighborhood, but Black people are always yelling at the screen. And in the neighborhood, you know when a movie is good, because the more people shout at the screen, the more it's received. And then the word of mouth is you have to go see this movie. So that the cultural interaction between narrative storytelling and audience participation is historically greater than it hasn't been. Star Wars, when I did Star Wars and when I played Jar Jar in Star Wars, that was probably the first global attention to toxicity and fandom via social media. Yeah. And there wasn't any, the platforms that we use right now didn't exist. It was like chat rooms and websites, and people really had to like care to hate something back then. And because Star Wars was such a global phenomenon, it really brought attention to what is now called toxic fandom. So, but even with the toxicity in the fandom, the attention to the almost the entitlement of audience participation in narrative storytelling was not only outlined, but in the spotlight.
Agreed.
So, Jan, do you have anything to?
The word entitlement very much, you know, struck a chord with me, and I think that you know, we're all supposed to be a part of it because we all are a part of it. You know, I think that that's something that we're going to be expanding upon throughout this entire panel, and you know, I'm looking forward to hearing from more of the folks.
Cool. So unless Aaron or Danny want to add, I can move on to the next question. Cool. So Danny, this one's actually for you. Yes, you. You kind of represent, in my eyes, the comic book world in this panel, and the comic book world is the foundation of the kind of current global pop culture phenomenon that we call the superhero film. And if we were to kind of involve audience more in building a cinematic universe, the audience would need to be held within a structure that moves the story forward. And comic books have been successfully doing this with thousands of characters in a shared collective universe for a very long time. Can you walk us through how the comic book industry has been able to manage such a massive amount of characters in one story world?
Yeah, and can you do that in like 2 minutes?
Yes.
I could probably
Whittle
do
it
it in
down.
3. 2 might be, the comics have been part of people's everyday life since the comic strips, where things like Gasoline Alley and Dick Tracy managed dozens, hundreds of characters. And there's always been audience participation in slow motion. In other words, postcards, letters. And so comic books have a similar thing. I mean, obviously the Marvel Universe is the most successful and popular at transposing that from the comics to the movies. And it took a long, long time to do that. It took several generations of Hollywood executives having to retire and die so that people could come in and say, oh, look, what they've been doing that's been, addicting children and teenagers for 50 years, maybe we could do that too. And the participation is letters and letters columns. Once in a while, you have a stunt like the death of Robin, where people got to call in and decide if Robin should die or not. In retrospect, I think DC kind of regretted that. That was, kind of considered in not the best taste whether you should be decided. So, so the interaction is involvement and passion. And I guess the next step, which is what gaming does and what Jan is trying to do, is to sort of make that participation more immediate and more pervasive. And look, that is the question that storytellers, again, now more than ever, have always had, is the audience. Stan Lee used to like to say that that you are our real editors. And part of that was hype, and part of that was true. As storytellers, our question and the $1 trillion question is, are our readers and viewers our editors and our bosses, or are they more interested? They want to make the stories or experience the stories, and there's no one answer. There's a whole gamut. So I think modern entertainment and education has to find different places to satisfy different customer or different viewer interests and needs, and the same viewer could have a different thing they want at a different time. Sometimes you do just want to experience a story and not have to be bothered with that, that stuff that makes your head hurt of what happens next. Leave that to the professionals. But other times, clearly, modern history has taught us people want to be involved and be in the game and make the creative decisions. So it's, I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Danny, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Just in terms of, I heard that
Was it a question about my book, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story? What was your question, Jan?
Wolverine being a crowdsourced character. So I've seen some evidence toward this, that Wolverine was essentially sent in, sketches were sent in for a character very similar to Wolverine into, I think, the letters column or something like that. And I've seen the sketches, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, on just the idea of potentially, because this is arguable, but potentially Wolverine, one of the most significant characters in all comic books, being crowdsourced.
You mean somebody is claiming that in the 1970s they sent in a sketch of Wolverine?
Yeah, and you can find the sketches online.
Okay, this is the first I've heard of that, but it's not, if you have these characters and they have a universal appeal, there's a certain logic to their development. And very often, somebody who's not officially tasked with coming up with a story or a character going to come up with it. So, you know, I've seen that. There are people who claim that they came up with Superman, who claim they came up with a million things, and it may be valid. They may have had a similar idea because something's in the zeitgeist, something's in the air. Is that I don't know if that's crowdsourced. I think that's just a kind of, I know what you're saying, but I mean, I think that's more of one or two people having a similar idea. But I mean, the idea that crowdsourcing, you know, since, I mean, you know, our coming, you could call the coming election crowdsourced. I mean, that's sort of what, you know, what do people want? And that's what all the controversy is now. If you send it in a letter as opposed to voting in your precinct voting place, is it as valid? And so that's the ultimate crowdsourcing, right? So I mean, people, you know, we always read the letters coming into to Marvel, because it did give us an indication of what our most passionate readers were concerned about or what they wanted. Like Jeff was saying, you know, you can definitely get a slow motion version of emailing and texting and commenting on social media. So as far as Wolverine in particular, look, I guess the Wolverine, I guess in Wisconsin or some state, that was their national mascot and various sports teams. So it would be, yeah, we are saying, why not have a character called Mr. Met or Mr. Yankee or something?
I think the character that came from the crowd someone who sent it in was actually called X or Weapon X. But has anyone else heard about this? Am I the only person, Jeff?
I had heard rumors, but I had about everything. Deadpool was, you know, somebody else, and so forth. There's just so many of those sorts of things. And believe me, remember, I was the letter guy originally at Valiant. I saw drawings of all kinds of characters, some of which anticipated or echoed something that was already in development. You know, there are only so many archetypes and so many shapes. So it's, you know, it's quite possible. I wouldn't call it, you know, kind of fan sourcing or the, you know, that sort of thing. This is if it existed, it was somebody's idea, exactly as Danny described. You know, there's the Badger too.
And then I think the ultimate expression of that, I think, is when Spider-Man first got the black costume. Before it was, you know, before it was a symbiote.
Right.
This was always a symbiote. The idea of a black costume for Spider-Man was sent in by a fan. And Jim Shooter, I think, you know, they tried to work with the guy to let him write the story, but he wasn't quite up to whatever a professional level then. But Marvel did pay him money for the idea of Spider-Man in a black costume. So that, you know, and look, going back to the Dazzler, we had, and going back to Millie the model, they would, Millie would always have credit a fan for having designed Millie's dress or Chili's hairdo. You know, now sometimes that was just like Stan's next door neighbor or the relative of one of the artists, but very often it was actual kids sending in designs. And I'm guessing the artist just used that as a basic inspiration to really make something that, you know, that an actual model of the 1960s would wear. So, you know, crowdsourcing has always been with us, but obviously our modern technology enables us to accelerate the speed and the level at which it happens.
Jeff, did you have something to add prior to the Wolverine?
Just a tiny taxonomy, because people think that what's going on is brand new and unprecedented and so forth. There are lots of precedents to the point of a kind of shared universe where there are dozens and dozens of characters who visit each other's stories. Let's look back at the Universal monsters, right, from the 1930s to the 1950s. By the time we got to the end of that monster cycle, this is Frankenstein, Dracula, the Mummy, the Wolfman. They were all running around in each other's movies in the
Hey,
house.
they even made Abbott and Costello.
Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, or Abbott and Costello
The
meet
Wolfman.
meet the, you know. But even before that, there were massive shared universes. There was L. Frank Baum's Oz, right? He wrote dozens of books, but after he stopped writing, there was an official person who took over writing those books with dozens of characters who jumped in and out of each other's stories. There was, of course, a Tolkien who created a massive universe with dozens and dozens of stories and things like that. And in order to do that, there needs to be kind of a basic set of rules that tie it all together. Now, Marvel and DC were kind of making them up as they went along and kind of retroactively repaired the rules and so forth. But it kind of can sustain itself once it gets underway. And by the way, people, in terms of audience participation, Homer used to go from town to town. And where did he go? He went to the bar. Started talking up his story so that he could develop an audience who would then come and watch his reading of the Odyssey, you know, in a small proscenium in that town. He had to build a personal relationship, storyteller and individual members of the audience, in order to get them into it, spread the word, and come out and listen to the story. And Greek mythology in general was something that was entirely participative because, of course, there were those archetypes, those Greek gods, but the stories about them, I mean, if you were clever at all, you can make up some story and build a temple and make that story real and permanent, at least for quite a while. And this is the basis by which we have the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Harry Potter or what have you in this day and age.
Well,
I love the idea of Homer at a bar dropping like mermaids on cats. You know what I'm saying? Y'all ever hear these half fish, half women people in the sea? What are you talking about, Homer?
Come on Saturday.
Aaron, did you want to add something?
Stories and crossovers.
Yeah, the relationship on the Greek, what Jeff mentions on the Greek thing has been called by many as the sort of the origin of live action role playing or LARPing. The Greek chorus. So you had the idea when you had these plays that there was a Greek chorus that would be commenting on the play, the action of the play itself, and that was very much some of the scholars in the Nordic LARP countries. Mike Pojala was saying that the LARPers are the Greek chorus, that they're the modern version of a Greek chorus that is part of this action. And it's Homer going to things like that, where LARPing also gets some of its historical tradition, is the Commedia dell'arte from Italy, where you had a traveling troupe of actors that would go town to town, and they played an archetypal character that would react to the people and location they are. So if they're performing before a nobleman, that will influence what they're doing. If they're performing at a bar, that influences what they're doing. So they would play an archetypal character like the fool, but what the fool did and how they did it was completely dependent on who they were in front of and where they were. And in terms of live action role playing, I think it's a really different approach than in terms of an art form and a medium of expression, because what we're talking about here is movies, comic books, literature, and things like that. And how are those things created as art forms? You have an artist or collection of artists who create it, and then they push this out to the world. And they hope that it falls upon an audience that enjoys that work. And LARPing although it precedes role-playing games, is heavily influenced on role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. And in that situation, you have people who are making it with you. The actual act of creation is made with the participants instead of a separate artist pushing out to someone else. And the best definition of live action role playing I heard was that LARPing is a medium of expression that empowers people to tell stories about themselves. And that is critical and very crucial for something. And so that when a designer of a live action role playing event is creating something, it's not, well, here's my vision of the world and you guys are going to act it out and hopefully you'll meet with it. It's, here's a world, here's what things are going on in the world. Let's play. What are you going to do in this world with these other people, with these elements that come in? And it's far more, I think, actively calling upon all the participants to create the world itself and the fiction and the narrative that happens. So it's a really interesting medium of expression.
Thanks for bringing that up, because with my initial question, that's where I kind of wanted to head with that, and the kind of idea of it within the current Hollywood structure that's not necessarily open to that line of thinking. How do we get there? Would anyone like to expand on that?
I could jump in, or you guys could go. I got something on it too.
To speak to Aaron's point, LARPing and fantasy role-playing games were completely, I credit it to everything that I do today. The reason, and my brand of role-playing kind of mixed LARP into tabletop. We didn't have beautiful parks to run around in. I was the inner city boy. So we had to stand around in semi-costume in the room and do these stories. LARP and fantasy role-playing games were the only thing that I could do to express myself that I could afford. You know, we couldn't make movies. I couldn't sit down and write a novel. I was 15 years old. This was a way to tell stories. Some of my work is based on my own fantasy role-playing and LARP games. A game I created or co-created called Troubadour became Lancers Rockers based on Robotech. And that was a thing I wrote. I made money. It went out into the world. Global Run 2020, about a race around the world, became Hot Wheels World Race, which I wrote and produced as an animated series for Cartoon Network that started around the table in Flushing, Queens. And
Flushing.
And Corridor, my fantasy world, became part of Dominaria, the world of Magic the Gathering, which is where my career really took off, and I got to be a part of something tremendous, and it got me out of Flushing. So
Shout out Flushing.
Little
we all
shade
have
on Flushing now.
So Aaron, I strongly empathize with what you're talking about, because those ancient traditions of yearning to be a part of the proscenium, a part of the gods, a participant in some kind of cosmic relationship, is being replayed to this very day, and allows us to tap into the deepest aspects of our creativity and maybe make a buck.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation, and to Autumn, I guess, in Hollywood and stuff like that. There's a couple ways that I think that potentially this can be approached, and sort of the question is well, should this happen? Like, does it need to happen? Is one question, and because a lot of LARPers will take a certain world or something and go off and do their own thing. Just like people on Halloween wear the Harry Potter costumes or Star Wars costumes in Halloween. They're doing it anyways. It's going to happen. I was looking at, so I think and obviously companies like Disney are embracing LARPers. So the new Star Wars land at Disneyland had Nordic LARP consultants, right? So they're looking at how do we engage the audience in this created universe, right? So the Disney Star Wars land is very much more interactive, the hotel and things like that. So I think what can happen, if I'm talking to any Hollywood executives, is to set up a corral of boundaries that the audience can play in. And what you do is basically like you're giving them choices, but the choices are dictated by you as the company. So you're getting the idea of like, oh, I can choose left, right, or center. Like, oh, this is me, I'm making decisions. Well, left, right, or center were determined by Disney. So you widen your thing instead of as a creator saying, well, this is the exact plot that happens and this character will always do this in this situation. You basically just open up to a little bit more choose your own adventure style, where you are giving the audience choices to make their decision and develop their own narrative, but you have limited the narrative and the choices that they can do. So that's one way of doing it. The second one is to kind of,
Aaron,
yeah.
Just to interject there, that's called the binary. At a story node, at the Disney theme park, at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, because I consulted on it and taught them LARPing.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what happens. A family can walk into that portion of the park, be confronted by a stormtrooper who says, where did the rebel go? And you can choose to lie to protect the rebel, or you can say, look, there he went, right over there. And because you're either wearing an RFID or your phone is linked or something like that, there's a tick that's made that allows for the park to do something to you later that day. So if you crash the Millennium Falcon in the ride, and then you're ordering dinner, the waiter will say, hey, you crashed the Millennium Falcon, no dessert for you, or something like that. And it really can create something magical, something intense. Now, that's a tiny fraction of what Aaron is talking about. You can make that deeper and richer and far more wonderful, but Disney is only going to go so far. I'm looking forward to the day where we can truly create a fully immersive a narrative universe that is absolutely participative.
Yeah, there's a couple like that. There's a couple more like that are happening in immersive theater. So there's a big relationship what's called immersive theater right now. There was an activation. So this is kind of where Hollywood's coming into this, is activations. So there was Comic-Con's got a bunch of them. So I went to the Blade Runner one when Blade Runner 2049 came out, and you came in and you were in a set, a really well decorated production design set, and can kind of just go about your business. You could go where you wanted. You could interact with these other characters in the way you wanted. You could see these things. So you had some freedom or agency, we call agency, to do these things, but it was still kind of limited. It was bounded. So again, you're getting to this corral. You couldn't necessarily do anything you wanted, but it seemed like that the actors, trained actors in improvisational techniques, would react to you, however you did it. And it becomes very personal. So so Hollywood doing these things, activations. There was a great one at South by Southwest a couple years ago on Westworld. That was a really big one. They built a whole town, Westworld town, that I didn't see it unfortunately, but you could interact in a Westworld town. They built it. But you're still, so in Hollywood, because Hollywood is really big about control of these things and their properties and their IP and making sure this stuff doesn't come out, and they have to do trademark enforcement. You're required by law to enforce their trademarks. So the way to do it for Hollywood, the trick is you create these boundaries, and they could be pretty big, but you still have controlled the playing field that the audience is going to interact with. And that's kind of how they can approach it. Another thing that I would love Hollywood to do is, if in that boundary, like, you know, what Danny was saying about Spider-Man and stuff, that if a creator is creating something that's very unique and special in that boundary, that they actually take that into the canon. They accept that you can kind of accept that a fan might be very creative and ingenious and able to add value to the property by their creation. And I think it's great that Marvel, you know, paid an artist who's like, let's do Spider-Man in a black costume and things like that. I think being open to it. And so I think it's a mindset ultimately of Hollywood, and not seeing it as a situation of, we have these paid creators and they are creating something and we're going to push it to you and we want you to like it. And you're actually inviting, to a certain degree, the audience themselves to be co-creators. And that does give up some control, but realize you can create the boundaries that they're controlling things in.
Jan, would you like to add?
Yeah, I got to add to this, because I totally agree. And this is stuff that I've been personally working on for many years. This is stuff that Jeff Gomez has predicted, 20 something years ago. I mean, it is inevitable that we will get there as a culture. Everyone's walking around with these production studios in their pockets. I mean, I look at it from the standpoint of direction, that the director has the most nuanced understanding of it. Any sector of entertainment I've worked in, the director is the one that really understands how to work with people toward a goal. And for us to look at these boundaries, Aaron, that you're saying, as DC, I think was calling it a while back, as a sandbox, because every director, when they were doing Suicide Squad, the first one, and like every director had their own little place inside the sandbox. That if we are putting people, the audience, on creative, essentially creative rails, via the rule set, the content that they create, because now I'm talking about making movies with the world, talking about making shows with the world, talking about making commercials, etc. If there are a set rules and then there's directorial guidance, we're going to get great content, because people are already making great content. So if you can essentially establish rules that if they follow, their content is canonical, because one of the biggest challenges, and you'll see platforms like Tongle, for example, that's an ad agency platform, but you'll see stuff where people are creating content. Doritos has something too, Legion of the Bold. People create content and then they submit it, and it may or may not be used, and that sucks. That sucks if you go through the process of creating something, you send it in, and then it just disappears into the void. And that sucks even more. I watched that happen to my dad, like writing something for Marvel. That sucks when you put passion into something that you love, and a story that you love, and it just doesn't go anywhere. And I think that there's a way for us to take the social media mindset of that positive, consistent positive feedback loop when someone is posting something or getting a like, etc., and actually apply that to storytelling and apply that to us sharing creativity together toward a goal of building out worlds. Like it's going to happen. And I think that you mentioned that essentially the thinking needs to change in Hollywood. And I don't expect that necessarily to come as much from the Hollywood sector as it's going to come from scrappy startups like ours, or people who are just really immersed in the world of making stuff together and sharing.
I'm going to take a slightly sorry, Aaron, just really quickly. I'm just going to take a slightly different kind of gaze on this thing. And I think we should look at Hollywood like we look at chunky spaghetti sauce. If you don't like it, don't eat it. And I think Hollywood is this thing where we believe that we all have to achieve, right? And it's not necessarily a place where you can achieve your ultimate creativity, especially when you're talking about the studio system. Because at the end of the day, they have stockholders that they have to appeal to, and they have to make X amount of dollars per year. So they are going to take and make the things that can get more eyeballs on screen and more butts in seats so they can satisfy their stockholders, right? And that might not necessarily be the thing that we all want to see. It's just the thing that they can make palatable to a larger audience. It is a very risk averse business, Hollywood. So, you know, and me being a creator of color, I am constantly trying to convince Hollywood that there is a broader audience for the stuff that I make. And most of the time they walk in and they see Black guy, let's do the Black guy stuff. And if I come in with a story about, you know, Black people in space who develop a shrink ray so they can slit through black holes, all of a sudden they're just like, yeah, no, sorry. I mean, is there hip hop in it? Can we put 2 chains attached? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like that all of a sudden starts coming up, and that actually crushes creativity.
Yep.
Now, the fact where we are right now, we have all of these accessible distribution models, not just on the social media platform, but, and the thing that I'm really excited about is the augmented reality platform, where you can take an idea in which you've created a LARP situation and put that in the actual world, right? So you don't need to create elaborate sets, and you don't need to make expensive, or, you know, much like Jeff, you were talking about, I grew up in the South Bronx. And I grew up in the South Bronx with a vivid imagination, a love for science. Shout out South Bronx, right? My grandmother's from Flushing. But I had a vivid imagination. I loved science, and I was a comic book fanatic, right? But no space. I was in an apartment building. We were all on top of each other and dirt poor. So we had no other choice but to create our own environments and our own worlds. And we did, right? But no one believes that me, a kid from the South Bronx, would be interested in that. They think we're interested in, you know, the hip hop and the, you know, the Megans, the Stallions. And I really couldn't care less. So what these new distribution models do, I think, is make this idea of LARPing accessible through your smartphone, right? And rather than build an elaborate environment, the environment is, or your reality is extended, creating a virtual environment with the environment that you live in. So I don't think Hollywood should be the goal. I think it should be a choice. And you can choose to go that route, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I think there needs to be chunky spaghetti sauce, basil and garlic, arrabbiata. You have to have all of these different choices to make, and they're all good.
I think what's happening, I mean, totally, Ahmed, exactly. What's happening is because Hollywood has to, they're trying to appeal one thing to as many people as possible. So you have to water that down, right? They're appealing to a mass audience worldwide, and a lot of money is going into stuff. And what happens is I'm thinking there's an inverse relationship between, let's appeal to the most amount of people somewhat, like sort of kinda, versus let's really appeal to a smaller audience. And so you can get a smaller audience that is rabidly passionate about your stuff, and they are going to just completely buy anything, versus let's appeal to everybody and they're like, yeah, okay, if I got nothing better to do. That's kind of the tug between audience and creators and things like that that go in there. And unfortunately, I think Hollywood is going for the mass. Let's get as many people as possible. So you gotta have kind of watered down stuff.
Yeah, and they're reactionary. I'm sorry, go ahead, Autumn.
No, I think this is, you're talking about basically a third avenue. You say, don't take the chunky sauce. Well, you've kind of had a hand in creating, some of your own characters that you created in the Star Wars universe. Can you kind of talk about your experience and based on that experience, how are you taking those learnings and kind of applying them? I know you're a teacher at USC and with the audience, with your world building initiative at Newhouse. So those things kind of go into creating that third option that you were kind of mentioning earlier. So I love that.
Yeah, well, I mean, my experience in Star Wars kind of set me on this entire path. And, I was very, I entered every day at work with open eyes and open ears. And I think what happened with me is I really watched George Lucas work. And I watched how he built the worlds that he built and tied everything together. And it's very different from what Disney's doing now. It's extremely different because at the end of the day, you only had to answer to one guy. And you see how fast iteration is when it's just, one guy's idea, one guy's vision, as opposed to a committee of people who think they know, right? Less decisions get made and everybody's worrying about getting fired. Like in Star Wars, I was the only one worried about getting fired, I was right off the Broadway stage going, I don't know what's happening. But starting my career off in this very huge major movie really made me see the possibilities. And it really gave me confidence in this idea that you can have an idea and see it through and trust your content, which is what I always say to not only my students, but to my, my peer group as well, who are all creators. So because I came up in that environment, I don't have a fear of trying anything new. And I don't have a fear of this idea that it might not work. You know what I'm saying? As a performing artist and as somebody who started in theater, it might not work as a part of the job every night. And sometimes you go out on stage and you do something and it doesn't work. And we talk about, the audience participation, and the wonderful thing about audience participation is if it doesn't work, they let you know, like immediately. You don't get the laugh or you don't get the tear or you just get nothing. And then, the beautiful thing is the next day you can go, okay, let's try something else. So being brought up in that and being reared in that type of environment really put my purview as far as doing what I'm doing now just on a different level, because I'm not really concerned with falling on my face. I'm really cool with that. I really enjoy it and I learn from it. So when Star Wars came back to me and asked me to do another show, Jedi Temple Challenge, I at first decided I didn't want to do it because Star Wars is this thing that kind of takes over your life, and you can see it now with the sequel guys, Oscar Isaacs and John Boyega. They're just like, I'm never doing this again. And I always say to them, yeah, wait 20 years. You'll probably be back. You know what I'm saying? Because that's what I did. I waited 20 years. But, right after the prequels, I was just like, this is just too much. And as an artist, I want to do other things. I want to be able to expand, But the beautiful thing is you are witnessing world building and LARPing and comic book lore and mythology and Shakespeare and the Greek chorus all in this one thing. And it's emotionally stimulating, and you fall in love with it. And now everybody who's been in a Star Wars movie tries to find that again, like that feeling of being involved in this universe that's being created from this collective and collaborative imagination. So when I started moving into doing my world building work and with my podcast, the Afrofuturist podcast, and being in love with Afrofuturism as a kid, growing up listening to Sun Ra and watching Star Trek and being in love with comic books, it really influenced how I wanted to approach all of these things. And then, you know, being interested in new and emerging technologies and ways to distribute, there's an avenue there now to get ideas out in ways other than those that are traditional, right? And then there's also this idea of augmenting those traditional ways, right? So I'm a director of a theater company out here in Los Angeles called the Echo Theater Company. And what we've started to do was use digital design, projection, as well as online to do interactive theater, but in ways that bring the audience into multiple experiences. So, you know, before the COVID, you would be able to go to the theater and experience the show live. And because of COVID, we had to start thinking about ways to really do that theater experience without being in the room. So we looked to technology and we looked to the web, and we recognized these platforms and saw what they were doing and what we could expand on. So we added cameras to a stage show to give you an experience that was both a screen experience and a live experience. We added, you know, as the virtual background to help tell the story. You know, we added projection and green screen to help you, you know, really feel this thing. And then with my world building thing, Afro Rhythms from the Future, we're using 3D modeling and animation and cards, almost like, you know, the Yu-Gi-Oh cards or the Pokemon cards, to help give you a choose your own adventure through the Afrofuturist lens to expand the ideas and just keep the creativity flowing. So I learned all of that from my experience with George because I watched him do it every day and I knew it was possible. And, you know, like I said, shout out to the South Bronx, being this kid with this imagination in the South Bronx, I just needed a direction. How do you do this thing on this level? And that's what that experience gave me.
Jan,
I love the idea that little Gomez and little Best were in the candy store reading Danny Fingeroth's comic book.
Right?
Free.
Yeah.
As fast as possible.
Before the guy came in, was like, hey, you're going to buy it? Then put it down. Like, wait, is Wolverine crowdsourced? I just don't know.
There's a lot, Autumn, I know you got something. There's a lot going on. I'm just gonna say really quick, shout out to the new technologies that I was talking about, like Twitch and YouTube. Like if you look, you know, where's the youth going? They're on Twitch and YouTube, which is kind of almost inherently an interactive medium, right? While Twitch is going on, you've got a chat going on the side of it. In YouTube, how many people, you know, YouTube are commenting on it, and the commenter, you know, takes that in and the input, and they're asking you, you know, I'm addicted to watching reactions to songs. I love watching, Jamal and Lost in Vegas. You know, I love reacting to this, but they're asking their audience, what should we react to next? What do you think of this song? What are good songs? And so these new technological mediums are already empowering a large group of people to be part of it. They're inviting you into it. So Twitch and YouTube and all the stuff. And the more it goes, augmented reality is continuing it. This is just perpetuating it. It's here. It's going to be here forever now. Once everyone's had the taste of it, they're like, oh, I can affect stuff. Going forward artistically, this is something that's going to be, around, for the rest of humanity, however long that is.
That's what
however long we have left.
Yeah, Hollywood is missing that thing. Hollywood is they wait for audience reaction. And sometimes that takes time, and they're not on the right platforms to get the immediate reaction, right? As opposed to, and this is what I tell the new regime at Star Wars all the time, you have this incredible creative fan base. Talk to them. You know what I'm saying? Find out what's going on. You know who did this really well was George R.R. Martin. He did this really, really well with Game of Thrones, right? When he was writing his books. He would talk to the audience and be like, hey, did I forget something? Is there a way that I did? Is there? And the audience would be like, yeah, actually, you fucked up. Now go back and write. You know what I'm saying? Like, we can really mine the audience and use the audience for that type of feedback in order to create the stories we want to create. Yeah,
Jan, you know, real world.
Danny had something to say. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
Thank you.
I interrupted
I think the whole cosplay phenomenon is important in this, that it's people not just dressing up for a contest or for a masquerade, but showing up at an event, walking around an event as a character, as different characters, and you see them, right? I'm at a table at a convention, and somebody dressed as Wonder Woman, often a guy dressed as Wonder Woman comes up, or somebody dressed as Spider-Man, and they exist on those two levels. They exist as the person, right, whoever is in the costume, but then you kind of think, well, look, Spider-Man is talking to me. I mean, this is what it might be, and there's something about sort of that type of crowd sourcing or crowd participation where somebody is just saying, I don't need any world, I am my world, and I'm going to walk around in the so-called real world. There's some power to that can be tapped into for storytelling and for viewer participation, identification, that I think is an element that shouldn't be neglected by any medium.
Yeah, that's a perfect lead-in, you know, to my question for Jan, which is like, you know, real world makes people part of the story, which inherently, you know, makes it more real, you know, pun kind of intended there. How can we make sure that, you know, in that narrative, the value of entertainment, there's more of an opportunity for it to be measured kind of by the impact that it makes on the world? Do you feel that way, Jan, about real world?
I think in general that the time for escapism is over, and you know, we need entertainment that serves us and actually serves the world, rather than just allowing us to escape our world for a moment and then come back to it. And I really see that the future is going to have a lot more social impact surrounding entertainment. And I remember looking at The Matrix and saying to myself, like, feeling at the end of that film that there was so much truth in there about what we were doing, and through the lens of creativity, they expressed this. And what did I need to do next? Like, I came out of that movie feeling like, what do I need to do? And at that point in my life, the Wachowskis could have said anything, and I was like ready. And there are tons of kids that felt the same way. And you know, I recently, you know, saw a film called that I saw only once before when I was a kid, called Powder, and
Great film.
It's amazing. It's an amazing film. It's so ahead of its time. It's so ahead of its time. And you know, I'm at a point in my life now where, after seeing that film, you know, I have the systems in place in my life that I can, you know, work on and experience even a smidgen of the type of power that this character Powder had, just because of meditation, etc. But a lot of people don't have these infrastructures in place, the scaffolded learning. And I think that we need to look at entertainment. There's value for us, and it's going to happen. So this is not just like I think. This is also inevitable. As inevitable as crowd participation, it's going to be people working together to make a better world, and using entertainment and using creativity as the uniting force. So I think that there's, you know, Star Wars has actually done some great stuff in this area as a brand. And I think that very much for what we're working on with reelwUrld as a fandom startup to bring people together. We have our project Justice for Hire, which is about fictionalizing solutions to real world problems and making sure that people can not only as a character grow, but actually grow themselves. And this goes into the science behind alter egos, which is the process utilized by some of the world's top CEOs, top athletes, top actors. These are very real. It's a lot of data on how changing an alter ego, creating and changing one, essentially helps you as a person, in a massive way. So I really think that there's a way for us, and this is very much what we're working on every day, to give the audience, empower them with the ability to create their own characters, to play in shared cinematic universes, to have these shared cinematic universes have layers woven into the narrative that actually cause real world effect, because the world is too messed up right now for us not to take action. And when I say us, I mean all of us, including every person watching this. It has to happen. Like, it is time, and there's no more time to waste. So I think that we as we as creators, I think everyone on this panel is a leader in that way, that's been uniting people and kind of directing them toward a goal of unification. So to me, this is just to be able to be on here with you guys and share this kind of these feelings, to me is very much a step in the right direction.
If no one has anything to add with that, I'd love to.
And crickets.
No, I think that's well said. But I think also and this is why I loved Marvel Comics so much. The thing what resonated to me so much about Marvel Comics was it was in New York, and I was in New York. Like DC, you had Gotham and you had Metropolis, but Peter Parker was from Queens, and my mom's from Queens. You know what I'm saying? Like, Captain America's from Brooklyn. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was able to put myself on these streets, and when I would walk through Manhattan, I could see myself as Spider-Man flying between the buildings. So that was augmented reality before we had smartphones.
Well, it was also smart.
We saw the streets.
Smart to put in New York, obviously, for native New Yorkers like us, and I have spent significant time in the Bronx and Queens. I just want you guys to know that.
Yeah.
Although I am a suave, sophisticated Manhattanite, as you can tell by every word that comes out of my mouth. But the idea of choosing New York, which has this mythic status in every medium, I always think it's funny. Of course, there's like the New York of Broadway and the New York of glamour, and then there's the New York, where you step in dog poop. I mean, those are the New Yorks that we know, and why we love to see it in the comics. But the idea that they took a place that, since Moby Dick, since Melville said Moby Dick, circumambulate your Isle of the Manhattoes, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing across the rooftops. New York was brilliant for people like us who literally live there, but it's also brilliant in that it's this fantasy land of popular culture for hundreds of years that everybody has an idea of what New York is, just like everybody has an idea of what Paris is and what the moon is,
Yeah. But it also brought in an education as well. Like, I learned so much from those comic books because it was the streets that I lived on. So when Peter Parker was a science nerd from Queens, I was listening to the science because I was a science nerd from the Bronx. You know what I'm saying? Like, it really resonated, and that really solidified, not just me wanting to learn, but my love for Marvel.
And on top of that,
Peter Parker went to high school in Queens in Midtown High.
In Midtown High, yeah.
And then, you know, Thor would get into an elevator and there'd be a black dude standing next to him, you know, making a comment, or there'd be a Latin dude in the street reacting. You know, you saw yourself.
Yeah, the multiculturalism. Yeah, absolutely.
There's
pictures.
I'm going to jump in. I don't know if you'll have enough time on this. And I'm not from New York. Sorry, native Californian here. I know.
How did he get on this?
I know. How did he end up on here?
Native California has its own set of myths that we all.
West
Jan,
Coast Avengers.
what you guys were saying about education is that's what I do. I use LARPs for education. And I'm doing it now. There's a school in Denmark that's all LARP based. Their entire curriculum is live action role playing. So we're doing the one I'm working on is we got a grant, $1.2 million grant from the National Science Foundation to do a science fiction adventure to teach girls programming and Ubisoft ubiquitous computing. And so the idea is that we're creating this world to teach. And I design LARPs for the classroom to teach in this narrative world structure because you are empowered in your narrative to learn things. And it's so amazingly powerful. I've seen it. And so this idea of letting people co-create things is so educational. And as Ahmed said, you know, that as everyone here is saying on this panel, that's exactly what it is. This empowerment of creativity helps people learn. It motivates them to learn it because it means something to them. It's personal to them. Oh, that's this person. I want to be this person in this place that I know. It's right there. It's amazingly powerful, and I think we absolutely need to harness it now. You know, in the world is, yeah.
Jeff, I just want to turn to you kind of, you know, this is the final question, then we'll kind of close out with a question for everybody. But you know, what is the current state of audience participation in storytelling? And I know you're actively working that and filmmaking, and what steps are you taking to disrupt the status quo right now?
Oh, thanks, Autumn. The current state of audience participation is actually in flux. We see it most powerfully in social media. We're all participants in this colossal kind of meta narrative, and in doing so, we're capable of affecting tremendous progressive change in our society. We've seen it, and it's just thrilling at points. People who historically have not had a voice now have an incredibly powerful and compelling voice. But it's also capable of being hijacked by defectors, by parasites, by people whose interests are not in alignment with the interests of the many, who are not, who are benefiting from fomenting chaos and conflict. We also see it in the reactionary response of mass media to the audience. I have stood in the boardrooms at Viacom. I have beseeched the people at Disney, do not wage war with your customers.
100%.
Put
it on a t-shirt, Jeff. Make a t-shirt.
If you ascribe to infinite diversity in infinite combinations, the underlying ethos of Star Trek, if you align with the ethos of the Jedi, you would never have sparked this terrible civil war business that is going on between fans and these beautiful aspirational story universes. And also you wouldn't then become reactionary, which is happening right now. Well, this didn't work, so let's do the complete opposite of it. We'll fire those people and hire these people who are conceding, appeasing this small group who happen to be screaming the loudest. And my final point is that I'm attempting to disrupt this kind of status quo of audience participation in storytelling by working hard for storytellers to have more meaningful relationships with their audience. We've all talked about the fact that there is now dialogue. Sometimes that dialogue is us shouting at each other. The next step is a little bit more complicated and demands a little bit more from us, but dialogue must give way to reconciliation. Reconciliation. That's what has to happen next in the storytelling process. What is it that has to be done for us to not do the standard hero's journey of knocking down everything in our path in order to get the treasure and save our community? What is the alternative to this in terms of finding third ideas so that polarization could give way to a network of brains that can manifest story worlds that function, repair systems that are badly damaged. If we do not repair the system that we're all in, it is self-terminating.
That's right.
It is self-terminating. We need to reconcile in order to project ideas that we didn't even know we had through the combination of minds in order to repair the system and be able to get ourselves out of the situation that Jan has been hinting at for this whole session. Please, let's join forces and do that.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm sorry, I know we're running up on time, but can I ask a quick question to the panel? How do you all cultivate your audience? Because, you know, those voices, those negative voices are loud. And we know that there are very few of them, but they are the loudest. So how do you cultivate your audience to get to like that you know, collective of minds that want to push the story forward?
I have a specific thing happening right now. So I'll try to be brief. I represent Ultraman. I've brought Ultraman over from Japan to revive him throughout the world. One of the first things that I did was call up C.B. Cebulski, the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, who I know loves Ultraman. We got a deal done. And so there are Ultraman comics from Marvel, my childhood fantasy manifest.
Awesome.
We take this to the fan base and we get these people screaming, no, not Marvel. Marvel is this woke a company that's going to just destroy your characters because they're going to turn Ultraman into Ultra Woman. and so forth. And it was like at first, and I was prepared for this because I've seen this sort of thing. It was still kind of shocking and made me a little sad.
Yeah.
And so you know what I did? Put on my armor and go swimming into the fan base directly. And I talked to them. And I said, so tell me exactly what your issue is. And how does that apply to Ultraman? And so forth. And do you know who's writing this? It's the Power Ranger dude that you love. And do you know what Ultraman stands for? Universal love. Universal aspiration. We all need to be ultra, right? And like, you're talking to me? You're listening to me? All right, I'll pick up issue 1. You know, and you do that one fan at a time. The reason I can do it one fan at a time is because that fan is going to talk to 100 other fans, because each of us is really a dozen people on a dozen media platforms speaking to hundreds or thousands of people. And that's how you do it. You know,
Jeff, I would have loved for you to end that interaction with, so enjoy issue 1 of Ultra Them.
I'll leave that to Danny.
Guys, I have a
I'll go
question.
first.
A question, unless anyone else has a follow-up to Ahmed's. My question is that if you were to build in like, 1 to 3 sentences, if you were to build a universe with an audience, a shared universe, what would it be?
Well, I'm kind of doing that now with this game that I created called Afro Rhythms from the Future. And what it is imagining a universe through an Afrofuturist lens. And what we do is we take the future thinking of indigenous people, update it, and say, I ideate and imagine from this point of view. And what's ironically been happening is I've been doing a lot of anti-racism training through this game, because what we've kind of discovered by a happy accident is most of these worlds that we create don't include white supremacy. And then at the end of the game, we all realize that you actually don't need it. And when you recognize that, the white supremacist power structure is actually an idea from a radical imagination, and it takes a radical imagination to change it, you realize how worthless it is. So that's probably the universe that I would create. I would create a universe in which this idea of racial superiority and racial hierarchy, as well as gender fluidity, the racial hierarchy and racial superiority doesn't exist, and gender fluidity is just as normal as everything else.
Beautiful. Anyone else have one to share?
There was the project that I'm working on now, the educational one that I said, is a science fiction world. So we're creating a science fiction world, and one of the design precepts I'm looking at is empowerment but consequences. So the idea of yeah, you could do these things or hold these views, but there can be consequences for it, as there are in-game fictional things, because we're talking a fictional situation, which I think is really important. That happens in LARPing and for education is that you could fail, you can make the wrong choice, you can do the right thing, but it's a fictional situation, and you can see, oh, okay, this is why this is a bad idea. This is why something like this shouldn't happen. And so in an ideal situation, it's one where, I don't necessarily want to be the one saying that such and such idea or concept of theirs is wrong. I want them to actually try, kids, especially for younger people, to try it and then have the experience of failure and realizing, oh, that's what is going on here. So it's something where people are empowered to safely, freely fail and realize the validity, like the lack of validity of their ideas or their concepts or things like that. And this is why this isn't working. You could see it without having to be going out in the real world.
Well, I've lately been working largely in the nonfiction realm. Biography of Stan, as some of you may know. There's some disagreement on Stan Lee's accomplishments and his good points and bad points, and what he quote unquote really came up with, and how he really treated people, and my world for the past few years has been biography, nonfiction, and as soon as you start delving into that, and again, just dare I say, read the papers or look at your news feed and see how much of that is, what part is true and what part is false and what part is spin. And I think it's really important to empower people to be curious in a way that goes beyond just whatever the headline that their internet feed showed them, and to really go research in libraries in the actual world and archives and talk to people who are surviving it. And of course, the number one rule is talk to the oldest people first. Don't think you'll get to them next week. So I mean, if there's a project, it would be to try to at least clear some of the clutter that we're all immersed in, and anything that is reality based or history based, because I mean, just interviewing people, very well-meaning people who had no intention of telling me anything but the truth about the same event or the same person. It really demonstrates you have to work hard to find out anything resembling facts or truth. So that would be kind of a project I'd like to move in. And because Stan Lee isn't controversial enough, I'm working on a project involving the Kennedy assassination, because there's no disagreement on that at all. So that's a straightforward.
Zero. Yeah.
That's just a straightforward. Look it up on the internet and report it.
Jeff, do you want to close it out for us with answering Jan's question?
The work that we're doing on a shared story universe is sort of under wraps, but I'll tell you one thing. We're shifting away from blood lineages and the chosen one model as an aspirational model. Self-actualization, the notion that it's all up here, and that makes it capable of opening up possibilities and making connections are the direction we're going to go with. It doesn't mean that there aren't these forces that are negative and pushing against what color you are or who your father was, but the lineage of kings is no longer, I think, terribly interesting.
Agreed.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. It was a pleasure. We really appreciate having you on the panel, and it was a terrific conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, audience. Everyone who's watching this, thank you all so much. I think that this panel, is very much full of people that really want to work with you. So that to me is a huge deal, that we have so many minds in one place that they're talking about this. This is we love you guys.
The social filmmaking revolution is upon us. Join the movement. Run!